let me ask you, what relationships have you had with Teatro Campesino? Where does Teatro Campesino fit in your personal life and your professional career?
Well, interestingly, during the course of my father's days of politicking and dealing with farm worker issues, he had a very adverse view of people like Luis Valdez. And he saw him as a communist, he saw him as a socialist, he saw him in a lot of derogatory ways. And I never understood that, but I was always curious and fascinated whenever my dad would pull out any publicity or PR that related to Luis Valdez. Of course, he was abhorring it, but on the other hand, I'd look at it and I'd see this mustachioed individual who seemed to be doing things for the rights of farm workers, and to me, I thought that was important because my own father was doing that very thing, but for migrant farm workers. And ultimately, when I took the position at the California State University at Monterey Bay, and in my capacity as a founding faculty, one of my immediate colleagues of the dozen of us hired to found the university was Luis Valdez. And so we worked very closely together. We were on committees together. We were engaged on a lot of different fronts. Luis ultimately stepped away from his role as a planning faculty after he founded the Teledramatic Arts and Technology program, which involved theater, multimedia, etc. And he left Phil Esparza there in charge of the teatro, or the theater company, and he remains there to this day while continuing projects in San Juan Bautista. Well, it happens that the Teatro Campesino is based or housed in an old packing shed there in the community of San Juan Bautista. And I remember when I first initiated the project at San Juan Bautista, I was warned by Phil Esparza, who lives in San Juan Bautista. He said to me, "Those people are going to eat you alive." And I took that to heart. And so when I started my project in San Juan Bautista, I knew that the small town politics had the potential to destroy any initiatives that I was going to begin. Well, from the outset, I'd always been fascinated with Luis Valdez and the teatro and its work, and it became more apparent to me that it was a social justice program. And so since our campus was devoted to that, and I was doing service in the community of San Juan, I found myself doing more and more collaborations with Luis Valdez. I've gone in and photographed their company. I've made arrangements to continue access to the church for their annual productions. The productions that they do are the Virgen de Tepeyac and the Pastorela, and they alternate those two productions, and every year I'm involved on one level or another. More recently, in working with the teatro, Daniel Valdez, Luis Valdez's brother, asked that I serve as a consultant on a grant through the state of California, the National Endowment, or the state's version of the National Endowment for the Arts. And so I was brought in as a content specialist, and I basically advised them on the history of the mission. I gave them access to photographic collections, and I kind of facilitated a series of interviews, one of which is now posted as part of their website on YouTube.
How about Guadalupe Valdez?
Oh yes, Guadalupe Valdez. She's a parishioner there at San Juan Bautista, and I've been a long-time parishioner, and so we've had a lot of occasion to interact. Because of her many projects there at the mission, especially related to the teatro's annual productions, we've had a lot of cause to interact both socially and also in the cause of maintaining the production programming that they do there at the mission.
You're a parishioner of San Juan Bautista?
Yes. So, and of course I've donated a lot of time, volunteered. I've also done consulting work and recently completed a major historic structures report, or at least a architectural history of the mission based on photographic and documentary evidence.
Where do you actually live, Rubén?
I live in Salinas, and actually when I first arrived at the university, I so wanted to move into the community of San Juan Bautista. I looked at housing, but housing there was very expensive, and I actually found a house right across the street from Luis Valdez's home. And at the time, my wife wasn't employed, and I didn't think it was going to be feasible. She didn't think it was feasible. And so we found a house in a development in North Salinas. And before we made that choice, we had colleagues at the campus say, "Why are you moving to that area of Salinas? Why are you moving to Salinas, period? That town is filled with gangbangers." And, well, I grew up around gangbangers. That wasn't an issue. But I also wanted to be in a neighborhood that was safe for my family. And the neighborhood turned out to be multicultural, very much invested in a very diverse community. It's turned out to be a great neighborhood. So.
What does your wife do?
My wife is an elementary school teacher. She presently teaches kindergarten, and she's teaching in a school, Natividad Elementary School, which has a 98% Latino, 98% below the poverty level student cohort. And so she's dealt with every imaginable social problem. My wife doesn't speak Spanish very well, but she has been able to communicate in the Spanish that she does have with the many meetings that she has with the parents of at-risk youth. She's constantly, maintaining the meetings. She's very committed. And ironically, after all these years and the way I grew up, even though I grew up in the same neighborhoods, was faced with the same challenges, because of carjackings, because of a number of things that have happened at the school, I've given her permission to go to another school, a safer school. And she says, no, I have an absolute commitment to these children. They need me more than most. So she's very dedicated.
How long is the drive? How long does it take you to get from your home in Salinas to your office?
It's about 20 to 25 minutes, and it's the same to San Juan. I'm literally equidistantly to the campus or to the mission. So.
Okay, well, thanks for that information. First thing I want to do, because we did not get this, unless you tell me otherwise, we did not get this on video, is to just repeat the questions and you repeat the answers of the barbecue chickens and
yes.
stuff like that, because that I think is good material for what we're into. So let's do it a little more broadly, because I'll follow up with other things. We've discussed about how the view of the Spanish and of the friars, Franciscans and others, in this country, in Mexico, elsewhere, and even among Latinos, is very negative. You have, and not only that, but I'm not talking now about research and scholarship so much. Have you seen examples in the popular culture and the attitudes, the popular beliefs of people that highlight that negativism and are completely wrong?
Well, let me start with something that I think helps contextualize this a bit. I'm on the board of directors of the California Missions Foundation, and we've given large amounts of money to maintain restoration and conservation in the California missions. And if you look at the demographics, if you look at the spending patterns of Congress and for historic preservation, very little money has ever been given to any of those Hispanic sites, any of those Latino sites west of the Mississippi. In fact, when you begin to look at the books, you see that clearly Congress has a bias towards the East Coast, which may well be simply because Washington, D.C. is there. But it's very clear that they have funded the restoration of synagogues, of Christian churches, not Catholic, that have some historic importance. And yet the California missions, until quite recently, were never included in that equation. That includes other, like ranchos and other sites. So at a national level, we do have a problem, a perception. The Missions Foundation has worked diligently to try to change that perception. On a more fundamental level, I do believe that this negativity, this denigration of the Hispanic tradition is rooted in a couple of places. One clearly is an Anglocentric perspective in which the British Empire had an agenda drawn and quartered from the Black legend, to some extent based on the writings of Bartolomé de las Casas, in which he documented atrocities by colonists who were of every imaginable European background in the Caribbean. And of course, because they were there under the auspices of the Spanish flag, these were then reconjured by the British Empire and then regurgitated for political ends. Unfortunately, that has translated through textbooks used in classrooms throughout North America to the equation that the Hispanic Catholic tradition is one born of a demonic possession of indigenous North America. The idea that what we have is native traditions were destroyed by the Spanish, and yet the British have managed and the Americans have managed to stay out of that equation by denigrating this earlier historical tradition. When we look at it at a very fundamental level, how does that translate into the way school teachers present the information? Well, the state of California, in conjuring its textbooks, always calls together community members and activists and others who have something to say about what should be in these textbooks. Well, it's clear that there has been a kind of a shift, both in the state parks that talk about the mission era and in places like San Juan Bautista. And so what you've got is the state park, which is adjacent to Mission San Juan Bautista. They are actually actively going out and having their docents, some of whom are Latino, basically denigrate the mission and its Hispanic Catholic tradition. They do it actively. They recently put up panels that minimize the contributions of the original Hispanic colonists and the Franciscan friars. When we get to the most fundamental level, how does that translate in the classroom? Well, in San Juan Bautista, I've had many occasions to overhear teachers or to find out from my students what teachers are telling children there on the site. We get 40 to 60,000 fourth graders, many of them Latino, of American Indian descent, who are being told by often teachers who are not Latino that these were concentration camps. They use that terminology, that the missions were ultimately concentration camps in which the Indians were tortured, they were beaten, they were raped and murdered, and thereby explaining the depopulation of indigenous California. On a couple of occasions, my students and I have actually overheard teachers. In one case that I heard specifically, and it was repeated by various teachers over the years, there are these 3 rectangular pits, and they're fairly deep. They have charred remains in the base of them. They have this very medieval looking ironwork and these iron grates and chains hanging from them, and they have cranks. Well, a teacher literally stood there in front of all these Latino children and told the children, this is where the Franciscan friars tortured Indian men, women, and children by lowering them into these pits of fire. And so therein you have this notion that somehow the Inquisition and the Franciscan missionaries in California had basically collaborated to the destruction of Indian society very directly. When we look at other elements of what is said, there are native activists in the area who claim that the walls of the mission are as thick as they are, in large part because the bodies of Indian ancestors were used as insulation in the adobe walls. And clearly this is ludicrous, but nevertheless, you take it from torture and rape and all these other things that have been conjured, and they minimize the contributions of the Franciscans, their charity with the Indians, and then they focus on almost a demonic representation of the past. On another occasion, I overheard a large American Indian male talking to 2 young Latinos, and they were standing on the edge of the arcade corridor and looking at this circular tile platform with a cement a donut in the middle, and out of the middle was this black object sticking out of the base. And the Indian gentleman, I walked right past this and overheard it, and I almost stopped, except given the size of the guy that was talking, I thought I better not challenge him at this point. He was telling the 2 Latinos, he says, you see that platform over there? That's where these Spaniards used to chain my Indian ancestors, and they would beat them and make them walk around in circles on that tile platform. Well, that's ironic, because what I wanted to tell him was, actually, that's a 1970s era water fountain that I myself dismantled with a group of minimum security trustees, and the black ring, that iron ring that he was claiming, was actually black PVC for the electrical wires for the water pump itself. And it goes on and on and on. So when you look at it in that way, you have a melding and a conflation of all kinds of scenarios that ultimately lend themselves to this denigration of the Franciscans, of the Catholic Church, and to the Hispanic tradition more broadly.
Let me get back for the sake of the video camera to the pits. This took place in with the teachers saying that the Spanish tortured the Indians. That was those pits are at San Juan Bautista?
Yes.
And they were manufactured in 1930, and they were used for other purposes, not what the inaccurate, the false purpose.
Yeah.
Want to tell them a little more about that?
Yeah, yeah, what I neglected to mention is that those rectangular pits that I was referring to insofar as the teachers making reference to Indians being tortured in these pits, actually I have photographic evidence and archaeological evidence and also oral history that those pits were installed in the 1930s both by Mutsun Indians and Portuguese Catholic parishioners there at Mission San Juan Bautista, and that they were intended as barbecue pits for the chicken that they barbecue every year during the annual fiesta. So yes, there were Indians involved. Yes, they did build the pits. However, they were barbecuing chicken and not Mutsun Indians.
Would you tell me the name of those Indians again?
Mutsune.
Mutsune?
Yes.
Do you want to let us know what the main Indian communities are or were in California?
Yes, California was perhaps one of the most eclectic regions, both linguistically and culturally. Archaeologically, we believe it was a major thoroughfare for the migrations into the New World from the Old, and that because of that, we have Athabascan, you have Uto-Aztecan related groups, Penutian, etc. When you look at the number of language or linguistic groups in California, anthropologists have documented over 100 distinct linguistic groups, many of them with languages that are mutually unintelligible. When you consider that, that's a recipe for conflict and all kinds of other issues. The main groups near Mission San Juan Bautista are typically referred to as Costanoan. In other words, those or people related to the coast. Interestingly, that derives from the Spanish term costeño or coastal Indians. And yet I've been confronted from time to time by people who correct me and say Costanoan is a racist term. We prefer our own indigenous terms. And I agree to one extent or another, but the problem is most of these groups don't know what their native names were. And so they draw upon the work of anthropologists to label themselves. And oftentimes they're labeled after individual villages. So other villages are excluded to the detriment of those communities because the name of a given village is used as the overall. Terms like Ohlone to refer to the tribal group extending from the area of the San Francisco Bay southward towards the Monterey Bay, that was a single village on the East Bay, and yet that name has been applied to all groups within the region. The people of Mission San Juan Bautista were predominantly what we refer to as Mutsune, but that again was only one village of many that once existed in the area. So we have a crossroads in that region of Ohlone or Costanoan, Esselen, who are also deemed Costanoan, and Salinan.
Chumash Indians were referred to quite a bit at Old Mission Santa Barbara.
Yes. Yes.
Is that the right pronunciation?
The Chumash are a group that extended almost to the area of San Diego, northward beyond San Luis Obispo. So they are a group that's identified with the Diocese of Monterey, and they're a group that was widely dispersed. They were very sophisticated. They were an advanced tradition with communities upwards of 1,000 people. So one could argue that they were moving towards a level of social complexity that we often deem to be tribes or chiefdoms, in which we have individual leaders who, through warfare and other tactics, are able to reconcile all kinds of resources. Well, when we look at the Chumash, we also have evidence that they may have Polynesian origins, because we have plank boats that they were using known as tomoles, and these plank boats are built almost identically to those from Polynesia. We have Polynesian terms within the Chumash language, and we have links between the Chumash and the peoples of Zuni Pueblo. So there may be links genetically that John Johnson, an anthropologist, has determined, and archaeologists have recently confirmed.
What's that word again? Costa. How do you pronounce that name?
Well, the Spanish term, of course, is costeño.
Costeño, right?
Or Costanoan.
Costanoan.
Yes.
Costa and then N-O-A-N after
Yes.
that. Oh,
yes.
okay.
But many tribal groups in the region, especially those that are revisiting their heritage after years of disruption, are often quite fanatical about condemning these racist anthropological terms and then adopting other anthropology-based terms as somehow more appropriate, which is ironic.
You talked about non-Latino teachers telling Latinos falsehoods. In your experience, what does let me divide it into two. What does the Mexican community, what do Mexicans typically think about the missions in Mexico and the Catholic religious orders in Mexico? What is their attitude toward this?
Well, let me tell you what I've seen, especially with regard to Chicano, Mexicano, Latino, and their perceptions of the mission tradition on the Monterey Bay, because that's the tradition that I've dealt with more directly, and I've attempted to work with. In addressing what these perceptions are, for example, Hartnell Community College is predominantly Latino, mostly Mexicano, Chicano. The community of Salinas is almost 60% Mexicano, and so this is their community college. And I've been collaborating with students, having Latino students come to the mission as volunteers to work with me there at San Juan Bautista. And some years ago, back in the late 90s, I actually was warned by a group of Latino students that I'd been working closely with that a speaker had come to the Hartnell campus and had just given a presentation about how evil the Franciscans were, how derogatory the Spanish tradition was, and that they should assemble a group and go to Mission San Juan and burn it to the ground. It is unfortunate because these same Latinos are basically destroying the very heritage that the Anglocentric British Empire would have us believe were these places of destruction of Indian society, were concentration camps. And unfortunately, many Latino students, because of the way they've been taught through the textbooks, because of the way activists have influenced them, tend to believe that this very tradition, which is at the heart of their own being, is negative, it's derogatory, and it's a blight on the Latino tradition.
Let me follow up on the Mexican part. In your chapter 2 on the mythologies of conquest, you made some comment, which I'd like to ask you more about. That Mexican nationalism, in the way I interpret it, Mexican nationalism overtly or inadvertently supports the Black legend.
Yes.
Want to tell me what your thoughts are about that?
Well, in my chapter on mythologies of conquest, I address at the very end of the chapter, I talk about martyrology. Martyrology is something that the Jewish people have been addressing through their scholarship, talking about what was essentially the Holocaust. And a form of that martyrology exists in Mexican nationalism, in which indigenous peoples and their destruction is decried in a way that basically then projects back onto the Hispanic tradition this very derogatory anti-nationalist sentiment. The irony is that collective martyrologies where we take and claim that we've been victimized, often include those who were the perpetrators, who are often the loudest because they detract attention from their own crimes or those of their ancestors. That's a different point or perspective, but I do believe that because of the Constitution of 1917 and all that it represents, it was a liberal reform movement, it was institutionalized in the Constitution of 1917. It basically sought to minimize the power of the Catholic Church. It sought to minimize the influence of Europe. It sought to, uphold the values of indigenous communities, which I think was an appropriate thing to do. However, Mexican nationalists to this day have continued to bifurcate the traditions of Mexico into two polarized extremes, in which we have the indigenous and we have the Hispanicist, and they don't meet. The irony is that in perpetuating that through their curriculum, for example, Josefina Zoraida Vázquez in her book Nacionalismo y Educación en México talks very directly to the fact that conservatives push one agenda and liberals push another agenda. And every time a new candidate comes to the fore, and previously to the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario, there was a tendency to go from one extreme to the other, and each time a conservative or a liberal or radical was brought into power, they would change all the textbooks to reflect either an indigenous or Hispanicist bent. Well, when you look at what's ultimately happened, the Aztecs have been upheld as the central and unifying symbol of the Mexican nation. There's much to be proud of in terms of the civilization of the Aztecs, but in making them literally the heart of their banner, of the banner of the Mexican Republic in 1824, what they've done is they've created generations of Mexicanos and Mexican American or Chicano students in particular who see the Aztecs as their direct ancestors. And they don't look into their own pedigree. They don't understand what communities they actually derive from. And they're almost unified in the sentiment that anything of Hispanic or European origin is somehow evil, that it is a taint on the blood and the pure blood of the Aztec descendancy. So when you look at it in that way, what we have is that nationalism has literally served as a cauldron for anti-Latino, anti-Hispanic, anti-Iberian sentiment. And the reality is we are communities that are derived of both of those traditions. And I think it's important that we learn to reconcile those in our understanding of all the cultural icons, symbols, and art that our communities produce.
Let me ask you about the Hersito Zapatista de Liberación Nacional. That's not a central Mexican phenomenon. And it seems to me that the EZLN has a very clear affiliation with the Catholic Church.
Oh, yes.
You want to talk about that at all?
Well, I believe, in fact, Comandante Marcos and the entire movement itself is born of liberation theology. You know, the church has had a quandary in dealing with priests who seek to help and liberate indigenous communities. Whether it's based on the efforts of Emiliano Zapata in the Mexican Revolution as an icon and symbol of this movement, the reality is that there have been abuses by the Guatemalan and Mexican governments. Indigenous peoples have been divested of properties. There have been all kinds of things that one can point to as examples of what has been inflicted on especially the Maya people. I do believe, however, that the role of the Catholic Church in ultimately, I wouldn't say turning a blind eye, but ultimately saying do what's in your heart, what's in your conscience, has permitted some priests to literally take the lead, take the helm, and push for the human rights of these indigenous communities. I would contend that this is not a new tradition, that it happened in the mission era, in the period of the viceroyalty, or the colonial era, as we call it. But many of these efforts on the part of individual friars or church officials like Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla in the revolution of, the independence movement of 1810 have often been minimized as sources for indigenous human rights. And so I do believe that this Partido Zapatista essentially is one of those movements that has in large part been inspired, or at least aided and abetted by officials of the Catholic Church.
You said something which I'm a little unclear about,
Mm-hmm.
and that is when the radical nationalists took power, they emphasized nationalism, which also was Aztec-centric.
Yes.
And then when conservatives did it, they emphasized the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
But my understanding is that the conservatives never were in control.
Mm-hmm.
Are you talking about in different regions? Because nationally, the PRI
Has dominated.
can be brought back with different names to 1917. And it's
Yes.
only until year 2000 that there's a change in government. As Mario Vargas Llosa once put it, the PRI is the most perfect dictatorship in the history of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So where does this change from one to another What are you referring to?
Well, in large part, the work of Josefina Zoraida Vasquez was based on textbooks. And irrespective of the labels that we take on, whether we're construed as conservative or liberal, the reality is that there's an interplay. If you are obviously Catholic and you're devoted to that religion or that tradition, you're likely to be influenced in your leadership, or at least in some elements of your leadership. While you may espouse a national platform for your party that suggests broad social reform and liberal agendas, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't gravitate to conservative representations of your history. And so what Zoraida Vasquez did was she went through and looked at the textbooks and found the nuances and the interplay and changes in textbooks that promoted certain leaders in Mexican history over others, minimized certain events, or emphasized them, whether it was the incident at the Alamo, San Antonio de Valero, or more recent issues in Mexican history. There has been an interplay. You can see this in archaeology textbooks as well, where during the period of the Vietnam War, there were many more publications that addressed warfare. When the environmental movement began, there were many more publications that focused both pro and con in addressing the ecology movement. The same thing goes on in Mexico today. The irony is you have groups like the Centro de Cultura Preamericana, and I actually interacted with them. I was invited to several events, and I attended a ceremony in honor of Cuauhtémoc, in which, because of my Yaqui Indian ancestry, I was asked to bring soil from the Yaqui Reservation in southern Arizona, and I sprinkled it in the place that was identified with Cuauhtémoc's burial in Morelos. While there, what I found was the Centro de Cultura Preamericana was very zealous. The irony is, when we attended the event, a publisher who was with Excelsior, Mendoza, was dressed as Cuauhtémoc. He was about as far from a person of Indian ancestry as I can imagine. The woman that was associated with him, they were pretty much all people of Spanish extraction. They weren't Indians, and yet they were promulgating this belief that the only way to rediscover our roots as Mexicanos was to learn Nahuatl. In California today, what we have are what I call Neo-Mexicas, and I've published to this effect. The Neo-Mexica movement simply means the new Aztecs. But I've been attacked vociferously on blogs and in other contexts for using that term because they take it to mean I'm calling them Nazis. I'm not calling them that. They're assuming that. But there are actually native leaders out there who have actually supported my views because they say in California, in places like San Diego, Mixtec speaking, Zapotec speaking, Tarascos and others are being told by young Chicanos and Latinos that they have to learn Nahuatl, that they have to divorce themselves of those languages because those are not legitimate languages. To me, this is the same attempt to minimize indigenous languages that many claim the missionaries were doing. And the reality is we're doing it to ourselves. If we look beyond that, when I first arrived at the California State University at Monterey Bay, I went into a couple of city offices looking for material. The Chamber of Commerce was one of them. I went into the Chamber of Commerce to look at their collection of brochures because I knew there were about 30 adobes in Monterey that were built during the Mexican era, specifically the Mexican era, from about 1820 through about 1848. And I thought, well, I'm going to find some material so I can learn who these families were. And when I went in, I found one brochure on the Adobes of Monterey. And when I opened it, there was about 3 sentences. It said, basically it started with the Indians were here for 5,000 years. And then it moved from that sentence to the Spanish arrived and with Junipero Serra, and they said several things about that colonization and destruction of Indian society. And then they basically went on to talk about John C. Fremont living in the Adobes of Monterey. And I thought, something's missing here. This brochure was intended to be about the Adobes, and they're somehow attributing it strictly to the Spanish presence, but they neglect to mention the Mexican era. So I was suspicious about that. And so ultimately, I began going to each of the sites and discovering that pretty much the Anglo families that had ultimately moved into these structures after they were built, after they'd been inhabited by the original builders, where many of them had been renamed to acknowledge those early American families. Then I went into a meeting with the Historic Preservation Commission at Colton Hall. And while I was sitting there, I was looking out a window, and I noticed a stone building, a small stone building on the, just below me. And I saw these, Anglo teachers bringing in just literally lines of young Latinos. All these brown faces were moving into this building. They were joking around, they were smiling, and they were entering this building. And every so often I'd look out and I'd see them coming out, and these children were no longer smiling. And I thought, what is that building? And why are the children changing their disposition? What's going on in there? And so I got suspicious, and during the lunch break, I went down to check the building, and it was the Colton Hall jail. And I thought, okay, that partly explains why they might have felt uncomfortable. And there are bars everywhere, it's stone walls. Well, I walked in, and immediately to my left was a jail cell. I looked in, and there were 2 cots, and on each cot there was a sarape, and on each cot there was a sombrero, and then there was a big guitarron. And I looked at that and I go, interesting, well that makes sense. This jail dates from about 1850, the early American period, and there were no others here other than the Mexicanos. Well, I went to the next jail cell, and there was virtually nothing in it, nothing identifiable to any given ethnic group. I went to the next cell, same thing. I get to the last cell, and there's a few items, but on the wall is a big picture of John Steinbeck, a communist. And I thought, something's not right with this exhibit. And I began looking around for any literature that might explain it, and I thought, why are they portraying Mexicanos in a jail cell? And is it because the home of the family of Tiburcio Vasquez, the famous bandit leader, is literally across the street from the jail and is now a law office? Or what could it be? Well, I began confronting city officials, or at least contacting them. And one day I was giving a talk. And during that talk, I was asked to comment on a new video production on the Californianos of the Monterey Bay. And nobody said anything, so I decided I'm going to address that issue in front of all these Latinos. And so I raised my hand. I started to go on about what I just told you, about what I felt was a suspicious representation of our heritage in a jail cell, and no explanations. Well, it turned out that the curator who assembled that exhibit was in the audience, an elderly woman, and she began to accuse me of denigrating her expertise. And the irony was, is after she began yelling at me, and I continued to respond as professionally as possible in this very large packed audience, a young African-American gentleman to my right stood up and started defending her, saying he was a docent. And so I turned to him and I said, I don't mean to be derogatory here, but if you entered that jail cell and the only thing you saw in those rooms was a black Sambo eating a big piece of watermelon with big white eyes, how would you feel? And all of a sudden, he was stunned. He said, I see what you mean. And he sat down, almost disillusioned. And then the woman attacked me again and continued to go on about how I was being offensive, that this, that, and the other. And then a young African-American male stood up again trying to defend his boss. And I again tried to contextualize it. And I told him, when we represent the past, we have to take care that those representations include the historical anecdotes that are key to those. This exhibit does not do that, and instead it leaves these children with the view that their ancestors were nothing better than criminals. And ultimately I did learn the story. And what was that story? It was that back in the 1850s, not long after the jail was built, a couple of Latinos were accused of stealing horses. And they were arrested by essentially a lynch mob. They were put into the jail, and that night they played a guitarron. And the town fell in love with them. Most of the Anglos in the community and the Mexicanos came to listen to them at their jail cell as they played the guitarron all night. And the next morning they promptly lynched both of them. Well, shortly thereafter, they discovered they were both innocent. So the lynch mob went out to get another 2 Mexicans to lynch. And I thought, that story just doesn't jive with why these 2 individuals would be portrayed and their histories represented in a jail cell. Take their exhibit and put their story into Colton Hall itself, where the California Constitution was signed by both Anglos and Mexicans of the period, and give them a little bit of respect rather than portraying them as a necessary element of the prison system.
I take it that you feel that part of your professional role, minimally professional, personal role also, is to confront or combat these false assumptions.
Yes, I've devoted a lot of my life to that, and it's become an obstacle politically because I speak my mind. Especially when it comes to the way we're perceived. I grew up in classrooms where I was the only Latino, and every time they would even so much as mention my ancestry, it was always in the context of those Mexicans at the Alamo who murdered our ancestors. And of course, I didn't know, myself to be anything but an American, but on those few occasions, I invariably knew what I was, and it bothered me. I wanted to know what my heritage was, and I began to explore it through the course and through the guise of the missions and the Aztecs. It was a conflated view of history. I ultimately came to see myself as Aztec, a descendant of the Aztecs. And when I was about 11, 12 years old, I actually began doing the Lord's Prayer in Nahuatl every night. Totatzin inilwikak timoeshtika maiktenewalo in motokatzin mawala in matlaskaitzin machiwalo, etc., etc. And so,
why don't you say the whole Lord's Prayer?
Well, I got through about half of it there, but ultimately, in conceptualizing my identity, both spiritually and culturally, in terms of the Aztecs, I didn't see the violence of their tradition, and it wasn't important to me. I was interested in their poetry, I was interested in their writing, their philosophy, their metaphysics, their cosmology, and I came to see myself spiritually as an Aztec Catholic. And so, and that was a conflation. I would burn incense, for example. I grew maíz in my backyard. I did reproductions of pre-Columbian art. I was invested as Aztec until I myself began working in the churches and missions of Mexico and began to realize that I had missed a major part of my heritage and began to reconceptualize it. And once I had a family of my own, suddenly I began to realize the malevolence of the Aztecs. That's not to say that they were a negative, they're not a blight on Mexican tradition, they're a point of pride. However, I see a disparity. When I grew up, Indians were construed as evil, vicious, barbarians, as primitive, as a blight on the land, and that their necessary eradication was an American cause, a manifest destiny. The reality is that was very wrong, and I knew it. Somewhere in the back of my heart, I knew that the way my ancestors were being portrayed, at least my indigenous ancestors, was absolutely wrong. Well, ironically, with the civil rights movement and everything else, and even my own work at trying to build a multicultural campus at Monterey Bay, now I see people going to the other extreme and now saying that, that the Indians were the God sent. They were the only pure spirit on the land, and they were eradicated by those evil, bastardly Spaniards. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, we're doing the same thing to the Hispanic tradition that we did to the American Indian. And the only common denominator that I see is the Anglocentric propensity to denigrate Hispanic and indigenous ancestries of the Americas. And if we begin to explore that and to interrogate that and to question the reasons for that, I think it brings us full circle back to La Leyenda Negra and the Black Legend.
Well, is there anything to be done to confront this problem of the Black Legend beyond single efforts by professors such as you and I? But any thoughts on how one could instill a collective action or movement?
Yes, I do believe there is. The problem that we face now is the Leyenda Negra has been permitted to fester for decades, for centuries. And what we are now faced with is an internet explosion that allows all kinds of information to be promulgated, to be dispersed on a global scale. And of course, in tandem with these new revelations about the role of Franciscans, the missions, we've got, archaeologists are really at the forefront of contesting these derogatory visions born of the Leyenda Negra. And the reality is that while this is now going on and the information and the data is available to us to prove this, not the least of which include the over 25 million documents written by the friars of the mission system in California that are housed at the Archivo General de la Nación, the AGN. The reality is that many of those documents are in Spanish. And the anti-Hispanicists often don't read the Spanish documents, and they don't really care. They're prepared to perpetuate an agnotology, which is essentially the fabrication of facts, or the quest for facts that support their ideology. And so these are political premises. They have nothing to do with the realities of that period. While individuals may have abused their authority in the missions at one point or another, the church and the government was there to prosecute those individuals and did so. But now that we're dealing with the internet age, we're dealing with a virtual divide in which Latinos are often not introduced to the kinds of information available for learning about their heritage. They have less access. That gap is closing, but they still have less access. So those who would perpetuate an Anglocentric profile of the Americas have a tendency to have a significant advantage in perpetuating these leyendas negras. And usually by the time Latinos come into their own, enter high school and college, they are radicalized almost immediately. I was, because I had not had access to any of this information until I arrived in college, and then suddenly I was angry. I was angry that it had been withheld from me. I took an indigenous perspective. And so what I'm saying is we're going to have an uphill battle. If you combine that with the anti-intellectualism of this age, what you're going to get is those who minimize what the authority figures in colleges and universities have to say. But I do believe that our role is significant. I do believe that publishers like yourself, the bilingual press, and institutions like the Hispanic Research Center have a key role to play, a pivotal role, in disseminating information, publications, and content that contest these representations of our heritage in so derogatory a manner.
Wow. You talked about what seemed to me you expressed it as a new phenomenon. You said something to the effect that now that new research has uncovered the positive contributions of the Franciscans. Beginning with what year? How did this happen? What's the origin of this?
Well, one could argue that there have always been apologists. An apologist are those who either people like Zephyrin Engelhardt, who was a friar himself based at Santa Barbara, sought to correct a lot of the perceptions, and he was often very zealous to the point of minimizing the Mexicans and the Indians in the course of building up the Spanish. So you have had these trends for well over a century. Those who've contested these derogatory portrayals of Hispanic and Latino traditions. The problem is that they've often individuals have derived from either the Catholic Church or other contexts where they had direct access to the documentary record. The public typically didn't have that access. The missions often were very closed to the idea of lay people coming in, or even scholars coming in and perusing their collections. Collections were often being stolen. Pages cut out of books, that's still being done. And so that has been there to the extent that we have had apologists. But I'm not talking about apologists here. I'm talking about recent research over the last 20 to 25 years in which archaeologists, in conducting archaeological investigations, in historical archaeology specifically, have been able to take the documentary record and reconcile it with the archaeological evidence. Because you can contest the documentary record. Typically what I get when I am attempting to portray the Franciscan tradition in as neutral or objective a light as possible, I often have people that contest and say, oh, well, that's what the Spaniards are saying. That's all propaganda. But that's what they were also saying in the early days about the Maya glyph system, in which people say, oh, well, the Maya are using it as propaganda. This wasn't the real Maya. They didn't really engage in warfare. They didn't really do this. They're just bragging. Well, the archaeological evidence has reconciled the fact that there was internecine warfare in the Maya region. They portray it in the murals of Bonampak and elsewhere. In California, people like Russell Skowronek, undertaking investigations in the Ohlone region, has been able to find that there was a much more agency, if we want to use that term, in that Native peoples were able to determine their own cultural, artistic, and linguistic heritage within the context of the mission systems. Jack Williams, another prominent archaeologist from San Diego, has now found, and this is the very recent research, that contrary to what we're told about the reducción, the reduction of Indian communities, when a non-Hispanic hears the term reducción, and they're told it means a reduction of the Indian population, they assume the Indian population went from this to this because of extermination, because of genocide, because of demographic decline, illness, etc. Well, the reality is that reducción was a program. It was the reducción de indios, but it was the attempts by the friars to bring indigenous populations into towns, which was part of a broader pattern in the Americas. The Aztecs experienced this with the conglomeration of large populations into major urban centers, and for good or ill, these were major points of development for these indigenous traditions. The friars would bring these people together, the indigenous populations, into towns, and they became Indian pueblos, pueblos de indios, as we call them. Many continue to argue, well, that was wrong. You took these people who were close to the earth, who were the noble savage, and you brought them into these conglomerations where they festered, they died of illness, etc. Well, Jack Williams in his research has found that contrary to what we say about the Indians being forced to adopt the Hispanic tradition or the Iberian tradition, what he has found is that actually there was virtually no reducción in the area of San Diego related to San Diego de Alcalá. The mission there actually continued to maintain itself without a resident Indian population. The Indians remained dispersed in their rancherias or their villages, and they would come to church of their own accord. That's in direct conflict with the idea that they're being forced to attend church. Yes, the mission bells structured their daily regimen, but the reality is the Indians maintained autonomy to the extent that they did. And very significantly, insofar as the work of Jack Williams, in his analysis of archaeological findings from a very broad swath of Southern California, what he finds is that Indians well beyond the penumbra of mission influence were actually adopting mission and Hispanic cultural traditions. They began to grow maíz, which is actually a Mexican introduction brought in by the friars. They began to adopt plows and horses and metalwork. They were actively trading with Indians that were linked to the missions, so those Indians within the missions were benefiting from that trade interaction. So the Hispanic tradition, adopted by the indigenous peoples of California, was not a coercive force. It was adopted broadly because it had practical application in indigenous communities. So between Skoranik's work with the Ohlone and Jack Williams' work with the Chumash and other groups, it's clear that the Hispanic tradition caught on. In my own work at Mission Nuestra Señora de la Soledad, I've been working there since 2007. And in the context of investigating that site, San Juan Bautista and San Miguel, what I have found is that indigenous populations were coming to the missions during periods of drought. They were coming from as far as the Central Valley so that they might survive within the missions. They were being fed, they were living with other indigenous populations. And interestingly, at Soledad, what we have found is there was an entire Amerindian or Esalen compound. They had their own plaza. They were separated from the mission by a zanca or canal, referred to as an acequia in the southwest, or acequia. And they were living in significant buildings, one of them over 375 feet long. And in those buildings, we found Mexican Indian ceramics. We found evidence of maize agriculture. We found metates, which are a Mexican Indian introduction. And as a result, I have an article or chapter coming out of a book from the University of Arizona Press here shortly, which deals with the Mexicanization of the California Indian. I would contend that in addition to this Hispanization of the California Indian and the Southwest Indian more broadly, you have a Mexicanization born of the role of the friars in bringing Mexican Indians as their assistants, as their allies, as their translators, and those Indians then inculcated themselves into the California Indian communities and influenced them and Mexicanized them in the process. Finally, what I would contend is that the depopulation of the California Indian is often decried, especially by Anglos and others, as a process of genocide in which Indian society was systematically and thoroughly destroyed by the Spaniards and the missionaries in particular. What we now find is that, yes, disease decimated many communities in early California. The occasional blight, if you will, plague that would affect certain communities led to a response on the part of Catholic officials. We're often led to believe, oh, the missionaries allowed the disease to spread and to inflict itself on indigenous communities. Well, I have documents and documentary evidence that, in fact, quarantines were placed on the missions in which Europeans could not enter those missions for given periods of time whenever there was an outbreak of illness in one community or another. There are specific prescriptions against it. Also, the missionaries did something that's almost unheard of in North America during the colonial period, be it the British colonial period or the Hispanic colonial period. They began to administer vaccinations in order to inoculate the Indians from these very diseases. This was a very expensive procedure in the late 17 and early 1800s, and yet they were doing it. Why were they doing this? If, in fact, the Franciscans and the missionaries had as their intent the decimation of Indian society, why are they spending valuable resources to actually save the Indians? Finally, as a result of investigations for a book called the Mission Source Book, I found a manuscript dating from 1830 in which a friar there at Mission Soledad actually wrote the first medical treatise ever published in California. That medical treatise was, of all things, for cesarean sections to be performed by Franciscan missionaries so that they could save the babies of women who had died in childbirth. So when we add all that up together, what we begin to see is a pattern in which the friars have been denigrated. They have been attacked and portrayed as these demonic individuals whose only agenda was the annihilation of Indian society. When you combine that with the fact that many of those indigenous communities that did survive in California, all of those were virtually identified with the missions. Many of their descendants have Hispanic surnames, many of them speak Spanish, many of their descendants continue to attend mission churches. But if you look at the policies in California, early California, the state legislature, based in San Francisco there for a period, actually put out a proclamation that the only way to deal with the Indians was to round them up and put them on the Farallon Islands right off the coast so that they could starve to death. They had a standing order to shoot wild Indians. The U.S. Congress, and if you read this work and the legislation through the work of Marta Menchaca, what you find is that Congress, the American Congress, actually put out a standing order with its military to exterminate the wild Indians of California and get them out of the way of our proper American settlers. And so they did that. There are documented cases at places like among the Mojave where they mounted machine guns above Indian camps when they were doing the ghost dance, and they literally annihilated entire communities. That was the American tradition. Of course, as a patriotic American, that's not the stuff we're supposed to be talking about. So instead, let's just focus on those historically derived people of color that were annihilating these people. The reality is the Indian communities of California, Hispanicized and part of the systems of compadrazgo that were developed for their salvation, ultimately led to those Indian populations being absorbed within the Mexican and Hispanic communities of California. Douglas Monroy is one of those who has talked at length about this broader process. So if you really look at it, many of those California Indians that survive to this day and often are antithetical to the missions can actually owe their survival to the missions.
We don't have time, but I'm going to ask you one last question anyway. What do you mean by revisionist? And the reason I'm asking you this is that Jaime Larra, I asked Jaime Larra, what has been the impact of your books? And he had very good things to say, but then he also said, well, there's a group that dismissed my work as revisionist. It's somehow a phrase that permits you to just discard something. What do you mean by revisionist?
Well, revisionism, the reality is that revisionism is one of those hot button terms that came into play when there were groups of conservatives in American history that did not like the introduction of anything related to the civil rights movement towards its demands for social justice, for the rewriting the histories. And they actually promulgated this term. They put it out there to say, well, these are not true American histories. These are histories of people of color that are not relevant to an Anglocentric society. And that's the way it was being contextualized then. One of the ways that we counter these kinds of movements in which our own histories are being brought into question is that we have to look at history for what it is. History is written by the victor is a very common notion, but the reality is that history is always in flux. It is an oscillating frontier that will vary and change from one moment to the next, depending on how we want to characterize it. And it's the national agenda and the way state and federal government is able to capture certain histories to promote, civic pride and patriotism, etc. Well, these stories about atrocities of the American Indians are not acceptable. We can mention them, but let's also mention the Little Bighorn. The Indians murdered, George Armstrong Custer. When I use revisionism, I'm using it in a revisionist form. I'm adopting the term used by those who would seek to refer to us as victims. And so by using the term revisionism, when I see the literature move in one direction or another to an extreme, I see it as revisionist. The reality is that it's new history. And I would say that for both sides of the spectrum. But the term revisionist is often an attempt to basically give a political slant, one way or the other, to the basic facts. And the facts are what they are. We can take them in one direction or the other, and when they go to the extremes, I see them as revisionists. When we look at what's happening in the California missions today, there are those who are labeling us as revisionists or apologists who would like to believe that we are perpetuating dogmas and that we're trying to slant things in other directions. But the reality is that if we look what's happened with the American Indian, even the American Indians that I've interacted with, a number of them scholars themselves, are very clear on the fact that people like Vine Deloria, one of my former professors, had pushed an agenda in which he tried to build confidence, build pride in American Indian societies. And I agree with that piece, but it's the way it's interpreted by those who are not scholars, who then use it to perpetuate political dogmas that I see as problematic and revisionist in the extreme.